Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars.
So I've been meaning to do, like, a essentially let's play of 1770-76. I have no idea how you actually pronounce that. I should have figured that out before I started recording, huh? I've been meaning to basically play through it. I have not read this, maybe hypermedia object that all the kids went crazy for a few weeks ago. I've been meaning to check it out, and I have not yet, because I wanted to record myself experiencing it for the first time. And unfortunately, I've been suffering from hell allergies, and a cold that lasted for like a month, and it's not getting better. It's never going to get better, and so I've given up. I'm just gonna fucking do it, and you can hear each and every one of my miserable snorts, unless the final version of this edits them out. I have no idea what I'm going to do with this. It's going to be an experiment. We're just going to see what happens. I've heard a lot of things about this, but only in sort of vague details, because I've avoided spoilers. I've seen some vague critiques, but have not read through them closely, and I've seen the very opening screen. So what happens is not going to be a surprise to me, but I do want to capture it because it was such an interesting, it's such an interesting technique. So I will be capturing that and commenting on it. But otherwise, other than seeing this described as an infinite canvas, which, just a reminder, that does not mean the canvas is literally infinite, that it's an infinite comic. It just means that the screen is utilized as an unlimited, unbounded terrain, rather than something that has sort of concrete dimensions. It's infinite, essentially, in its potential. But other than that, I have no idea what I'm in for here, and I don't really know anything about football, so yeah, this is gonna be an adventure that might not be useful for anything, and a huge waste of my time. Let's find out! So let's see how far I can get on this page before it does the thing that I know that it's gonna do. Unless I fucked up and this is, I've already looked at it in this browser. No, I have not. There we go. Yeah. Well, okay. Okay, so a lot is going on there, right? So unfortunately my browser, oh, this is interesting. This is very interesting. Unfortunately, my browser, I'm using Sleipnir. It's my, like, secondary browser that I use for reading webcomics, and also for, like, streaming stuff like this, because it's just a little bit cleaner than my Chrome, which is a mess. But Sleipnir, I guess, is a bit slow, and so that animation that we saw, what you caught a glimpse of briefly there was the text sort of ballooning out and taking over the screen and blacking out the screen. I'm assuming that's, I haven't dug into the code at all, but I'm assuming that is done with JavaScript, which is interesting and something that's probably going to come up at some point later. I don't want to delve into it too much now. But what's really interesting to me here is that this is time variable, meaning that accessing the comic or the whatever the fuck this is, accessing the hypertext object at different points in time will render different results, or different points within your progression through the narrative will give you different results. So if we go back, it's literally impossible to access. I'll click the link again, and yeah, the first time you access it, it will be an article that is immediately sort of like enveloped in this text and becomes something much, much stranger. And there's no way to access it again except on another browser. So yeah, that's pretty interesting, because that's not really a feature of hypertext stuff that, like, at least in hypercomics, that was not something that I saw outside of, like, one theoretical experiment, from eMerl in, like, the early 2000s. Outside of that work, there just wasn't there wasn't really any other experimentation until Homestuck, which, like, straight up involves going through and rewriting bits of the comic depending on where you are in the comic, which is wild. And now this is doing something similar on a smaller scale. And I think that the experience is one of being sort of forcibly transported into this fictional space, and there's no way sort of back to your own main time, which is pretty interesting, I think. I'm not going to read all this out loud, because that sounds really difficult and frustrating and tedious for me, and probably not all that interesting for you. I don't know. I mean, like, I guess if this is a real Let's Play, I would be doing that, but I'm not going to. Oh, wait. Is this... Okay, so we've got a conversation here. This is... I thought that this was... I assumed that this was just stylistic. But it looks like it's not. It looks like this is actually the chronology of when we hear... when these messages go out, maybe. Interesting. This is a great example of the way that space and time are the same thing in comics. Not quite the same thing, but like space operates as a stand-in for time. Here in this very literal way that we're actually getting a calendar, but having to scroll through these blank spaces is really quite upsetting, actually. I know you said to preserve my power, and you can't hear this, but I have to talk to you. I miss you. So we've had so far 2 messages from this, from 10. And I think that the space of this really works to highlight the loneliness, to make that kind of experientially significant. So there's a plausibility to 9's... Wait, shit. I'm confusing the 2 of them now. Green text is 10. Red text is 9. Yeah, I think there's a plausibility to 9's response here, that is... we're invited to feel that as a tangible thing through the space of the comic, which is something like, this is what makes this a hypercomic, is that we've got this lengthy scroll. Part of what makes it hypercomical is that this is a kind of wastefulness of space that I think would be very difficult to create in a print comic. And I think that also the experience of scrolling down is significant, because like we can't, there's a strong limitation to how far ahead we can sort of see something, which is achievable in print, but this is I think that the effect is... Wow. Oh, this is like emotional. This is actually very emotional. In ways that I wasn't really expecting. So it takes a year and like a third, right? For 10 to be able to send a new message. One fucking message every year and a third, and you waste it on yes you do, buddy. God damn it, 10. Son of a bitch. I am so psyched to scroll for 27 years. Hell yes. Let's do... Oh. Oh, come on, Sleipnir. It's gonna be a real bitch if it... Oh, there we go. Well, that's interesting. Is this the Pioneer spacecraft? What? Alright. So, 3 characters now. This is all very Homestuck. I mean, this is wild because, like... Okay, so... A little bit of background here. Part of McCloudian kind of comics theory is a strong emphasis and privileging of images. That comics emerges in the juxtaposition of images. What makes Homestuck questionably a comic is that large stretches of it are not imagistic, but tell the narrative through these lengthy chat logs. But that's kind of weird too, because it's not really a it's not really like a novel either, because, you know, chat logs aren't a novel, or at least, like, sort of typically that's not kind of novelistic language. The rhetoric of it doesn't really fit anywhere else. It's clearly not a it's not a script meant for performance. So it's almost like reading a play that is not intended for any kind of performance whatsoever. And so as a whole, it's very, very strange. It's just hard to kind of slot this into the rhetorical traditions of much of anything. But now here along comes prancing 17776. I'm gonna say it differently every single fucking time. Along comes this thing, and once again we've got essentially a chat log. And more than that, it's a chat log that, like Homestuck, is color-coded. And also, I mean, like, it's color-coded, which helps in the absence of chum handles, like Homestuck has, and it's also indented, which is interesting. Anyway, here's Carcat. Yeah, okay. So I'm a little faster on the uptake than 9 is, and yeah, 9 is the Pioneer 9 probe. So that's cool. This is really interesting. This is such an interesting sort of collage technique. I don't really have anything to say about that. It's just cool. Is Steely Dan still together? Probably. Oh god. Wow. Okay, so they're gonna watch some football. And then I guess this is a video, because welcome to modern hypercomics. Shitty Statues of Liberty. Oh yeah. Baby, we're home. So, the football game takes place over the entire field of Nebraska, with Wyoming and Iowa on either sides. The game has been going on for several decades. The game is headed straight towards the tornado. It might go up in the twister. Oh my god. 117,000 yards away from the goal line. Okay. You know, I don't think that this is how football is typically played. I don't know a lot about sports. But I assume that football typically does not, take place over entire states. But, what do I know? So, I guess that people still have to buy things in the future? That's interesting. 1,000 years, name me one thing that's different. That's a fascinating line. They fixed all their problems. War, poverty, disease. Those are all extinct ideas. Okay, this is interesting. Who was it who said, even if life is forever, each moment of it is a miracle? I think that's just something we tell ourselves. We're just ordinary and forever, I think. There's a leveling out that happens if you live forever and ever without anything to lose. As someone who is stridently anti-death, this is an interesting thing to postulate. 17,000 years and this person has never been to New York. Oh my. This is great. This is great. I love this. This is, yeah, this I can buy as a response to immortality. Just an eternity of cataloging the worst media and turning it into a podcast. Yeah, sure, absolutely. Why not? That sounds about right. This is relying heavily on video in a way that I think is really only possible now in an age of high-speed internet connection and ease of uploading to YouTube. It's something that was much harder even when Andrew Hussey was beginning Homestuck. I think that was relatively more difficult, and certainly was much more difficult for anyone who wanted to include animation within hypercomics in the early 2000s. This is a good example of the way that technology sets the boundaries for what kind of games can be played within this hypermedia space. That sounds like that could be a metaphor for something. I wonder if there's a single place in the whole world that's never had a story. I bet not. I just about guarantee you there's no place like that in America. Every little square of it, every place you stomp your foot, that's where something happened. Something wild, maybe something nobody knows about, but something. You can fall out of the sky and write into some forgotten storybook. You run and run and run, and you keep turning pages, and none of them are empty. They're full of stories. There's nowhere left to write. I think I'm just a bookmark. Seems okay to me. Alright. Well, what the fuck? This is great. This is really great. This is great. This is Gödel's theorem with fucking football. But instead they tried to define what can't be defined without a supercomputer. They took the catch rule and tacked all kinds of conditions and notes and everything onto it. Eventually the catch section was 50 pages long. And you can only have so many rules until some of those rules begin to contradict each other, or stack on each other in different ways. What we believe happened is that during this game, one of the teams cited a constellation of rules from across the rulebook and used them to argue that they owned part of the field. And of course, once that became possible, the teams raced to lay claim to as much of the field as they could. Before long, individual players found that they could also present legal arguments for splintering off into their own factions. For one reason or another, some of them did. There were 4 teams, then 7, then 25, and at one point there were as many as 100. Some of those territories consolidated, and now there are 58. Territories 8 through 11 were originally one unified territory. A bureaucratic tug-of-war splintered them into narrow lanes, which were then further carved apart by interests that had nothing to do with the football game. What we've got here is, rules building on each other in perverse instantiation. Part of Gödel's theorem, Phil Sandifer recently got into this on Twitter. He wrote up a whole thing about how part of Gödel's theorem, but what the insight there essentially is that if you've got a rule set of sufficient complexity, if you've got a set of axioms of sufficient complexity, eventually they start to spit out contradictions. They start to spit out paradoxes. Or at least that's my understanding of it, is in agreement with his understanding of it, and I'm sure that actual mathematics doesn't really agree with either of us, but nevertheless, as rule sets complexify, they start spitting out potential paradoxes. And furthermore, as we sort of develop video games further and further, video games are these complex sort of simulation systems that also are governed by complex rules that similarly can result in paradoxes, which is great. That's actually a really awesome thing, because that creates these sort of glitch possibilities, which can be bad and game breaking, but can also, let you fucking glitch through walls to speedrun across the background of an entire level, which rocks. That's awesome. It's so cool watching that happen. So that becomes part of the gameplay. So by complexifying the rule set, they created these paradoxical states. This is interesting to me in terms of hypermedia, because hypermedia similarly increases the rule sets and kind of rhetorical complexity of whatever it is, whatever media it's manipulating, which I think is interesting, because if we're talking about sort of rhetorical rule sets, if we're talking about the creation of a kind of, if not language, then rhetoric, an ad hoc or a bespoke rhetoric. These hypermedia objects have to generate a bespoke rhetoric, right? So, this indentation system, the system of colors and indentation that we see here, is a bespoke rhetoric that indicates who's talking when, right? The introduction of more materials, inherently forces a complexification of that rhetoric, and possible sort of contradictory or weird or ambiguous states. So this is a place where, like language itself, the introduction of these sort of complex communication systems inherently introduces ambiguities like, I mean, that's the core. I'm working on this whole thing with Death of the Author right now, and that's part of what that is like, basically you experience a text as this whole raft of ambiguous multiple meanings, but Roland Barthes suggests that we are the reason the reader is the thing that defines a text is because it's in the reader's mind that we can actually resolve these ambiguities, or not resolve, but like hold them in our heads all at once. That we can step outside of the paradox and say, that's interesting. These two things contradict each other, and yet they are together. And I have no idea where I'm going with any of that, because this is entirely off the cuff, but it's interesting that this rule set, in order to become more and more hyper-standardized in terms of just mathematical precision, in the process of becoming more and more rigorously defined, in the way that we see with a lot of sort of media studies stuff, the kind of rigorous, deeper and deeper rigorous definitions of comics, for example, that are designed specifically to deal with corner cases like this story. The continuous definition of new materials like that, of the continuous redefinition of things to account for side cases, actually results in greater and greater contradiction that like the human mind can simply accommodate in this really, really straightforward way of holding two contradictory thoughts in your head at once and recognizing the paradox in front of you without fucking exploding. So I don't know what to do with that insight, but it's really exciting to me. Let's keep reading. Oh yeah, Broncos fans are crazy. I love this. And also, like, I mean, this makes perfect sense. Like, okay, so to recap, so basically, Juice is describing to 9 and 10 this game that, due to greater and greater complexification of the rules, eventually became this bizarre series of snatches for territory and has just become like a fucking, basically like an ongoing 1,000-year siege. And like people still come to the game, which is enabled in part because of a fucking generous re-entry policy to the stadium. And this is actually, like, this makes sense. This is basically durational art. You know, like, you don't fucking go to see Marina Abramovich perform The Artist is Present. You don't go to that expecting shit to happen, right? Like, she sits there, you sit in front of her, she stares at you, you cry, and you leave. Like, it's not a thing where things happen. It's about durationality. It's about the sustained performance of an action. It's not performance in the sense of putting on a show, it's performance in the sense of doing a thing. She is performing the act of being the artist who is present and sitting there and staring at you. And like sometimes things do happen, like sometimes someone will start like taking off her clothes because like I guess just the prospect of being naked for Marina Abramovich is really appealing. Which, like, yeah, I don't know, like, maybe I would go there and sit down in front of Marina Abramovich and be just like, you need to see my tits. Like, it's totally plausible. It's totally possible. But, like, expecting that to happen is not why you go. you go to experience a portion of this durational piece of art. Like, in a similar sense, I think that we can draw a parallel between that kind of durationality and something like, oh god, what is it called? Like, the Forever Clock or something like that. Something suitably epic that, like, this is a clock that functions on the scale of centuries and millennia, right? Like, we're not gonna fucking see that thing do things, but it would still be interesting to see in terms of, like, being in the presence of something visualizing deep time. How valuable the visualization of deep time is for an immortal, I don't know. I don't know. I think it's impossible to know in our current state. Like, just the phenomenological difference that would be is so profound that I think it's very difficult to grasp. But, like, maybe that's the point. Maybe for these people, it is still phenomenologically impossible to grasp deep time. And so this is essentially a durational art piece. This is a durational performance piece that might help to visualize deep time. And apparently, like, the fans seized a bunch of the territory and demanded brown mustard, and the stadium management wouldn't do it, and so they turned it into a lake.